What's good, YouTube? Welcome back. Thank you for clicking onto this reaction. I hope you're looking forward to it just as much as I am. If you haven't already, head over to the content creators page. That link is in the description box down below. If you haven't already and you're enjoying our content, you know what you need to do. You need to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, but we're going to jump straight into this one.
In 336 BC, a 20-year-old Alexander the Great ruthlessly consolidated power in Macedon and securing the allegiance of prominent nobles. That done, the up-and-coming Argead monarch spearheaded daring expeditions in the north, south and west, before finally obliterating Thebes as an example in late 335.
And he really did just obliterate Thebes.
With Macedon's borders secure and his royal authority unquestioned, the stage was set for Alexander, tutored by Aristotle in the Homeric epics, to finally turn his glory-hungry gaze eastward. He would use the lethal army inherited from Philip II to invade Persia, a massive 3-century-old dominion, almost 50 times larger than his own.
What a feat. What an absolute feat indeed. The kingdom was around for longer, was so much larger, and he just set his eyes out for it, hence why he was the GOAT.
Welcome to the second video in our series on Alexander the Great.
I'm looking forward to seeing what Kings and Generals have got for me.
At the river Granicus. After leaving behind him the smouldering pile of rubble that was now Thebes, Alexander the Great returned to Pella and gathered all the Macedonian magnates. Together, they began planning the invasion of Persia.
So it happened
During
quite quick
meeting,
then.
The king's advisors counseled him to take a wife and sire an heir before departing. However, either due to political calculations or because his interest in women was tepid at best anyway, Alexander refused this suggestion.
Oh, that's really interesting, because we obviously know how the story ends. So the fact that this come up so early on into his life and within his story, within history, and he didn't take action upon it is very interesting, because what really would have happened if he did just secure some kind of succession, even if he necessarily didn't want to, but he felt like he had to do it as a duty. What could have happened then?
Royal finances were also in a precarious state following a year of non-stop military campaigning, and so the king was forced to turn to his companions and nobles for assistance.
As you always do,
Propagandized
rely on the people around you.
That Alexander doled out sections of the Macedonian crown lands until the finances of each companion were provided for. One of them, Perdiccas, is said to have asked the king, "But what have you left for yourself?" Alexander replied, "My hopes."
He had a dream and a goal, and he knew that that was all that mattered at the end of the day.
What the king was doing here, though, as Peter Green bluntly points out, was borrowing money. With the assembly thus concluded and all matters...
So in regards to his best friend, them two being more than friends, that's completely fair, and I do think that is the case if you have a look into it, but it doesn't necessarily stop you from creating a succession plan out of necessity. I'd imagine that there were probably a lot of people in the past who didn't necessarily like women and preferred the male gender, but they still done certain things to secure the line of succession. You know, yo Jay, I hope you're doing good. And what else have you got to say? Like, Philip II had already come pretty far along his own plans to inherit Persia. Alexander just inherited his father's grand ambitions and plans. That makes complete sense. And Zod, you're just sort of agreeing with that.
Prepared, Alexander, his companions, and the invasion army advanced through Macedonia and Thrace via the route used by Xerxes I in 480 BC. Leaving Antipater as regent at home. 20 days and over 300 miles later, the Macedonians arrived in the Chersonese and prepared to cross the Hellespont. However, while Parmenion did the donkey work and used 160 Hellenic League triremes to conduct a complex but unopposed crossing from Sestos to Abydos, Alexander went south and crossed at Elaeus with a small force. According to one account, just as the king's ship was about to make landfall in Asia, Alexander, clad in full armor, launched a spear into the sand and thereby claimed the eastern continent as Spear One land.
Interesting. Was that just Was that more symbolic than anything else?
To the gods, and conducting religious ceremonies the whole way.
Yeah.
The king made a sojourn to the mythical city of Troy. Alexander then went north with his entourage, which included his closest companion, Hephaestion, and united with the main muster under Parmenian's supervision on a plain near the town of Orispe.
So they're united
As
again.
this invasion of the Achaemenid Empire begins, it's worth going over what kind of army Alexander had at his command in 334 BC. It was undeniably the most tactically and technologically advanced military force.
Yeah, he had
of the
those
age.
phalanx.
However, unlike such greats as Genghis Khan and his enemy's predecessor Cyrus the Great, Alexander hadn't made his own army, but inherited one developed by his father Philip II.
Okay, I guess that's a good point. Do you know what I mean? He didn't necessarily make it himself. He was just lucky to inherit from Philip II, his father.
Waiting for their enterprising king on that broad plain near Arispe were 12,000 of the best Macedonian heavy infantry, 9,000 sarissa-bearing phalangites, and a further 3,000 elite hypaspists, otherwise known as shield-bearers or guards in the sources. Whether these crack troops were armed as peshetiroi or as standard Greek-style hoplites is heavily debated, but it's possible that they changed to fit the situation.
So they were interchangeable. Was that so? What was the main difference between the two types? Why did they need to be so interchangeable? What made it so useful?
This prestigious unit was led by Parmenian's son, Nicanor. Secondary to Alexander's front-line heavy infantry were 7,000 allied hoplites drawn from cities of the Hellenic League and 5,000 hired mercenaries armed in a similar manner, which was still good for the era. To supplement these battle line units were 7,000 Thracian levies from tribes such as the Odrysians, Triballians, and others. Most vaunted of all were the 1,000 archers and Agrianians, expert skirmishers, who were...
It's crazy to think that there was barely any cavalry used within this warfare.
Described as the Gurkhas of the ancient world. If one was to also count the 11,000 infantry of Parmenian's advanced force holding the Macedonian bridgehead in Asia Minor, Alexander would have had 43,000 infantry at his disposal.
That's not that many at all.
However, in the wake of minor defeats against Persian generals before...
I say it's not that many at all, but that's in comparison of the amount of people that we have available nowadays. I'd imagine that the amount of people around back then was largely significant compared to us now, so it would make a difference.
Before the main army arrived, it's uncertain but possible that most of this smaller army was withdrawn to Europe.
Okay,
Therefore,
interesting.
we will assume that most of Parmenian's 11,000 were either already integrated as part of the invasion army or remained behind with Antipater, leaving Alexander's infantry total around 32,000.
So only 32,000.
Comprising the Argead monarch's mounted strength was first and foremost 1,800 hetairoi,
Again,
the
such
highly skilled
small
companion
numbers.
cavalry, at whose head Alexander would so often charge into the fray. They were commanded by Parmenian's other son, Philotas. There were also 1,800 of the equally skilled Thessalian cavalry, whose reputation for horsemanship almost matched that of the Macedonians, as well as 900 mounted scouts from Thrace and Paeonia, with 600 horsemen from the Greek cities.
So there is still a fair few mounted troops, but again, there's no sort of heavy mounted troops. They're all sort of light armoured, aren't they? He's a great general, probably Alexander's best general, to be honest. Okay. Cavalry was not that common in the Western armies at the time, but Eastern powers like Persia relied phenomenally on the cavalry, or predominantly on the cavalry, sorry. Cavalry was still as important part in a lot of Alexander's conquests. It does, but it just doesn't seem like there was as many.
Overall, disregarding the 1,000 possible bridgehead cavalry, this brings Alexander's total cavalry to 5,100. Accounting for the possibility of some forces already in Asia, it seems fitting to bring the invasion force's total number of troops up to a nice round 40,000. Accompanying the
For an invading force, 40,000 seems such a little number.
soldiery were auxiliary elements, such as siege engineers, sappers, surveyors, administrators under a certain bookish Cardian bureaucrat called Eumenes, and scholars who would study and document the exotic wonders of the near-legendary East. Aristotle's nephew and Alexander's boyhood friend Callisthenes also served as the king's official historian.
And is Callisthenes the best friend that he's a bit more fond to than anyone else?
Alexander marshalled the army to readiness the following day. Then, almost certainly motivated by a mixture of scouting reports and supply concerns, began a march eastwards towards the satrapal capital of Hellespontine Phrygia, Dascylium. Rather than taking the entire army, the king left behind his 12,000 League and mercenary hoplites, perhaps suspecting their loyalty if put up against other Greek mercenaries.
Okay.
Making good time with his core Macedonian infantry and full 5,000 to 5,500 strength in horsemen, Alexander warned his men that looting and burning en route would not be permitted, as this was Greek land under occupation. More deviously,
okay. Nice, that's smart. So he's trying to keep the populace on their side for this initial, the initial part, because they also have cultural ties to the Greeks.
Properties of a dangerous Greek mercenary general in Persian employ, Memnon of Rhodes, were to be especially respected in order to make the Achaemenids distrust him. The Achaemenid Empire was a colossal entity of prodigious wealth.
It was
its
massive.
dominions so vast that the great king, a recently crowned Darius III, did not feel it necessary to deal with such a petty frontier disturbance personally.
See, I also agree. With an invading force of only 40,000, you wouldn't think that it would be that threatening, you know? Yo, Jay, hope you're good. We should be jumping on the Ukraine videos a bit later. One or two episodes after this. It depends on what area you're talking about. During the Middle Ages, 40,000 was a huge number of men, and seen as most kings struggled to muster up 20,000. Okay, that's interesting. It seems like a small force to do a whole invasion. Do you know what I mean? If you were doing a raid across a country, I would understand 20 to 40,000, but a full invasion seemed like a lot to me. But again, I might be uneducated. Like you said, it does depend on what era.
Instead, several satraps from the western provinces, including Asames, Spithridates, Asates, and several others, mustered their forces and met at Zelaya in May 334, together with Memnon of Rhodes, to take counsel on the incursion. Fully realizing just how lethal Alexander's meat-grinding infantry would be in the field, and aware that the invaders were short on supplies and money, Memnon gravely counseled the Persian satraps not to engage in a pitched battle. Instead, they ought to enact a scorched earth policy, burning crops, fodder, provisions, wells, and even burn villages down if necessary.
Once again, I think that's a smart strategy. Do you know what I mean? They've got a smaller force. Well, clearly Darius III isn't that worried because of the size of the force at the point in time. Their supply lines seem to be weak. Do not engage them, starve them out, and it's a numbers game in this situation.
By doing so, and opening a second front in Greece using the Persian navy, Alexander would have to scurry back to Europe with his tail between his legs. This objectively shrewd advice meant possibly unnecessary sacrifice on the part of Darius's western satraps, and they balked at the prospect.
Really? I think that would have worked.
Lands, and subtly accusing the Greek sellsword Memnon of lapsing in his loyalty, the Persian governors universally rejected the scorched earth plan and chose to fight it out.
Fools.
It's also possible that the satraps were all too aware that the great king had a reputation for scorning shirkers among his subordinate rulers, and weren't about to suffer his ire for no good reason.
Ah, I see.
A number of other factors
so they were scared of political repercussions as well.
may have contributed to this choice, such as the Persian code of honor and internal politics.
Interesting. I'd like to know what the Persian Code of Honor was like.
Apps such as Arsaces were used to getting their own way, but Memnon, a Greek, owed his high position to Darius himself rather than them. Arsaces in particular had a reason to distrust Memnon, as the latter held royally appointed estates in his own satrapy. Whatever the reason, the Achaemenids mustered their forces and marched west to a position on the river Granicus, set on facing Alexander.
First fight between Alexander and the Persians then, really?
From Arispe, Alexander took his smaller, mobile army up the Hellespontine coast via Pacote and Lampascus before advancing eastwards. Arriving on the vast plain of which the Granicus was the standout feature, the Macedonian army was arrayed in a standard preparatory formation with 2 lines of phalangites in the center and the baggage train behind. Cavalry and light infantry screened the flanks and served as reconnaissance troops in front. In the late afternoon, just before the Granicus, Alexander's scouts rode back and informed the impetuous king that a Persian army had finally been sighted.
Oh god, it's been so long since I've watched the Epic History TV reaction that I'm struggling to remember certain bits and pieces. I don't know if this battle was covered in it.
On the far side. This news prompted Alexander to redeploy his forces in battle formation, a task he was swiftly able to accomplish due to the battle-ready marching order. However, when the Macedonian army got to the river, its generals quickly began having reservations about the prospect of immediate battle. Lined up atop the steep far bank were just over 10,000 Persian satrapal cavalry from across the empire, roughly twice Alexander's total.
Yeah, I was about to say that is a vast, a significant difference in cavalry.
Arsaces and Memnon of Rhodes led Cilician and Greek mercenary cavalry on the Achaemenids' left, flanked to the left by Arsaces and his Paphlagonian horse. Hyrcanians under Spithridates assorted mounted troops in the center, and Bactrian cavalry to their flank. On the extreme right was Rheomithres, leading a contingent of mounted Median troops. As the Persians had ever since their empire's defeat in the 5th century Greco-Persian Wars, roughly 5,000 to 6,000 Greek mercenary hoplites had been raised to serve as the satrapal army's heavy infantry force. However, possibly because they had the same suspicion of loyalty as Alexander had with his Greeks, the satraps positioned this hired unit a mile or 2 behind the river, under the command of a Persian known as Omaris, too far away to take part in the main battle.
So the issue with that is you're so worried that they're going to run away halfway through the battle that you're going to sort of set them up later on. But they're not going to be able to come in and reinforce you, because if they're losing the battle, then why are they going to then commit? The battle's already lost, you know? It's quite interesting. The phalanx is the difference between the two units, I see. This battle was covered by the Epic History TV channel as well. Thanks, DZ. Alexander was pretty broke at this point, so he kind of had to win. He borrowed huge sums from the Macedonian lords or nobility. I see. Thank you very much for letting me know. Numbers mattered less in ancient warfare. Tactic and skills, training, experience, and good equipment could compensate. That makes sense. I do agree with that. What did you also say, DZ? I think Alexander also incorporated local forces after he conquered them to gain more numbers. That also makes sense as well. And this battle is Alexander's best. I'll be very interested to see why.
The rock-hard centre of Alexander's line were 6 1,500-strong brigades of the phalanx, led by Meleager, Philip, Amintas, Craterus, Conus, and Perdiccas. To the right of the phalanx were Nicanor's 3,000 Hypaspists, and then Philotas and Alexander himself at the forefront of 1,800 companion cavalry, several hundred mounted skirmishers, Agrianians, and some archers. 2,700 Thessalian, Thracian, and League cavalry were on the left under Parmenion. Following the army's deployment, Parmenion rode over to Alexander's position and counselled the king to delay any battle until the following morning. A hasty and most probably failed attack over such an obstacle as the Granicus now, he reasoned, would be a fatal blow to the entire expedition.
Smart.
However,
Listen to him,
if they waited
Alexander.
until morning, the Persians, observing Macedonian superiority in infantry, might withdraw from their position during the night and allow an unopposed crossing.
Okay, interesting.
Our sources disagree on what the response was. However, most tell us that because of his Homeric desire to achieve heroic status through great deeds,
He
or not
decided to
wanting
go
to
through
buoy
it.
Persian morale by hesitating,
Alexander decided to go straight in right now.
Alexander
Interesting.
disregarded Parmenian's cautionary advice and prepared the army for an immediate attack. Clad in magnificent armor on the right wing, he was easy for the enemy to see, and so a number of elite contingents under the satraps shifted to oppose Alexander's elite Hetyroi hammer, hoping
Take
to
the head
kill
off of
him
the snake
end
and the rest to
incursion.
follow.
The Battle of the River Granicus finally began when the Macedonian king sent a mixed vanguard of prodromoi mounted skirmishers, Paeonian light cavalry, and a small unit of companions and his Agrianian favourites into the river, with the
How does this
outward aim
battle
of
actually
securing
play
the
out?
far bank. However, facing some of the best Achaemenid cavalry from the treacherous and slippery riverbed, they met predictably stiff resistance. Throwing spears and other pinpoint-accurate missile weapons rained down on the beleaguered advance force, causing terrible casualties from a distance. Some of these satrapal units descended to meet the Macedonian vanguard in melee combat in the riverbed itself, removing them from the advantageous higher bank. This attack gradually drew in even more regiments from the otherwise unengaged Persian line.
That's good though, because if they're able to break that Persian line up, that provides more opportunity for Alexander to take advantage.
Disrupting the orderly formation on Aristides' left and shaping the battlefield to Alexander's requirements. With the enemy drawn out and exposed by the sacrifice of his vanguard, Alexander charged wholesale at the head of just under 2,000 companion cavalry, arrayed as it was in a wedge formation. Galloping into the river obliquely to the right of the advanced force, and thereby meeting little resistance, the Hetyroi and their king were able to swing left and crash straight into the exposed Persian left wing in the riverbed.
And it looks like a lot of the other leaders and commanders are here, so I wonder how many of them Alexander takes out.
Where most of the enemy leaders were fighting.
Yeah. So how many of them died? I can't remember.
This struggle against the best Achaemenid cavalry was, as Arrian relates, a cavalry battle with, as it were, infantry tactics. Horse against horse, man against man, locked together. The Macedonians did their utmost to thrust the enemy once and for all back from the riverbank and force him into open ground, while the Persians fought to prevent their landings and hold their opponent.
Look at that. I know. Oh, could you imagine being in the middle of just a cavalry bloodbath? Like, if your horse goes and you've got to fucking walk around in that and people are just getting slain left, right and centre, the hooves are going, you've got to deal with that. Crazy. Absolutely crazy. Alexander is the GOAT, Jay.
Back into the water. The companions' discipline, skill and armament rapidly began to turn the tide. In particular, the Macedonians' efficient use of the cornel-wood cistern lance compared to the lighter spear of the Persian cavalry. However, despite this...
So it's just more durable, so it didn't have less chance of breaking. Was it also longer maybe as well? What was the difference between the two spears?
The Granicus on the Persian left, Alexander, in the thick of the fighting, became the target of a concerted effort by the Persian leadership to kill him as the spear tip of his forces pushed their way onto the far bank. Accounts differ as to the nature of this clash, but Arrian informs us that at some point after Alexander's retinue penetrated the line, his spear snapped and he was forced to get a new one from a bodyguard.
Okay.
Isolated on the far bank with just a few companions, the king was quickly beset by several contingents of enemy cavalry. The leader of one, Darius III's son-in-law, Mithridates, was slain when Alexander wheeled around and drove his newly gotten spear into the Persian's face.
Nice. Nice. One of your enemies down, Alexander. Just a few more to go.
It was only a moment later that another Persian aristocrat, Rosakes, confronted Alexander and lopped off a part of his helmet before himself being felled by the king's lance.
I remember that.
While
I
locked
do
in
remember that.
mortal combat with Rosakes, the latter's brother, Spithridates, satrap of Lydia, bore down on Alexander from behind and prepared to deliver the coup de grace. The Persian sword was about to fall and end the 22-year-old king's life. However, at the last possible moment, an officer known as Cletus the Black swept in and severed Spithridates' arm at the shoulder, saving Alexander the Great's life.
I bet that man was well rewarded. He would be well rewarded if he was my man. Saving my life like that. Holy shit, you will be looked after.
By that point, having inflicted fearsome casualties and cut down many Persian commanders, the companions were getting the better of the Persian cavalry all across the right wing. Furthermore, the Agrianian skirmishers managed to breach the Persian formation's integrity.
Oh, so the other lines have come into the battle as well now.
And get in among the beleaguered enemy horsemen. As this hinge point on Alexander's right was being hotly contested, Parmenian's wing was charged by Rheomithres' Bactrians and Medes, but managed to resist the assault.
Nice. Is Parmenion going to be able to break that side and then pivot into the centre?
In the centre, 6 Taxius of Phalangites and Hypaspists advanced inexorably across the Granicus, ineffectually showered by the Persians' missiles. When it became clear that the companions had punched straight through the Achaemenid left, the satrapal army broke in a wave of panic reverberating from Alexander's point of impact on the right,
just
all the way to
leaving
Parmenion on the left, who had managed to hold the Persian.
Just the opposition just fleeing there, leaving the commanders to be encircled.
Cavalry there. A number of gallant Achaemenid units fought to the death in the river, while an equally great quantity, included among them Memnon of Rhodes, used their mounted mobility to escape the field and ride to Miletus.
So that they can fight again later, which is fair. I think we would all try and flee at that point in time, wouldn't we? Definitely.
They were able to do so easily, because Alexander, Parmenion, and the phalanx, which was now on the far bank as well, didn't give chase to them. Instead, the Macedonian cavalry wrapped around the unengaged and now woefully outnumbered Greek mercenaries on either side,
Doesn't he kill them?
While the phalanx lowered their sarissæ for another fight. We're left with no concrete reason as to why the satrap's hired infantry didn't march forward and join the main battle. It's entirely possible that Alexander's lightning assault and victory, which according to Professor Michael Thompson, was accomplished in less than an hour.
Like I said, once they realised, because they were mercenaries, once they realised the fight was lost, you're not going to then go in and commit, are you? I am 90% sure, remembering that Alexander kills these men because they're not to be trusted, right?
Took the Greeks by surprise and left them with no ample opportunity to react in time. Unfortunately, we can never know for sure, but what happened next is universally recounted. As if all of a sudden realizing their dire situation, and probably believing that a fellow Greek king wouldn't be too draconian, the mercenaries petitioned Alexander for mercy.
Which they didn't get.
Rather than granting it though, the Macedonian monarch assailed the Greeks en masse, butchering thousands of them in a hard-fought last stand. Plutarch claims that the king had been influenced more by anger than by reason, but one of those reasons might have been to make the brutal point: if you're a Greek mercenary, do not fight for Persian gold, or you will receive no mercy.
Which is completely fair, but what was actually said? But he, influenced by anger more than the reason, charged foremost upon them the loss of his horse, which was smitten through the ribs with a sword, and most of the Macedonians who were slain or wounded fought or fell there, since they came to close quarters with men. I see. They were desperate, that's the reason. Okay.
It took more casualties in this phase of the fighting than it had in the process of forcing across the river. In the future, the king would never again be so reckless and uncompromising in dealing with similar surrendered units, indicating just how much of a toll they inflicted. Whatever the case, about 3,000 were killed, and another 2,000 sent back to Macedonia in chains, where slave labour in the mines awaited them.
I see. So even though he'd done it, he learnt a valuable lesson, which was to do something like that. The loss of men and resources was too much, so that's why he didn't do it again. Because obviously they sort of fought until the last stand.
Between 1,000 and 2,500 of the 10,000 Persian cavalry had also fallen in the battle, together with almost a dozen named higher officers and governors. On the victorious Macedonian side, casualty totals were far lower. Taking into account the possibility of propaganda to glorify the victors, our sources state that 100 to 120 cavalry were lost and only 30 phalangites.
Is that it?
However disputable these figures are, the strategic result was not. All of Asia Minor now lay open for the taking.
All for Alexander.
After visiting the
He has his eyes set and he's going for it, and
giving an honourable burial both to his own men and the fallen enemy warriors, Alexander appointed his own replacement satrap for Hellespontine Phrygia, instructed him to maintain the general status quo, and then moved south. Zalaea was taken and pardoned, while Parmenion was sent with a flying column to take over nearby Dascylium, which had been abandoned by its Persian garrison. Then, about 8 miles short of Sardis, the garrison commander and many other leading figures came to meet the Macedonians in order to surrender the fortress, treasury and the city in its entirety to Alexander.
It become a point where you've got to do certain things to protect your people and to protect your lands, and it was easier just to submit and hand it over to Alexander than to fight him at every single point of the way, I guess.
From initial insecurity and near collapse after Philip's death in 336, Alexander had managed, in just 2 years, to crush an Achaemenid army in open battle and occupy one of the greatest capitals of the ancient Near East.
Literally doing so much. He started when he was 20. He's 22 now, and in 2 years he's already done so much. Absolutely crazy what this man could have achieved.
But that was just the first step. Far to the east, in the heart of his massive empire, Darius III began raising an equally massive royal force to confront the invading Macedonian king himself. As Alexander considered his first victory from a newly dedicated shrine of Zeus at the Sardis Acropolis, looking out onto the great continent beyond, he had to have known that the real challenge was about to begin. Once again, thanks to Hunting Clash for sponsoring
and it
this
really,
video.
really was. And I'm looking forward to finding out what we've got in store in the next episode of the Alexander series by Kings and General. What a great video in